Allied airmen were shot down over Germany, their chances of escape and evasion were almost non-existent. There was no real organized underground to help these downed airmen get back home. However, getting shot down over occupied Europe dramatically increased an airman's chance of evading the Nazis and getting back home. Now granted, there were dangers and hazards these men had to contend with, such as being picked up by the Nazi ground troops almost immediately, or being led into a trap and captured, or the betrayal of a safe house by a collaborator. There were any number of ways an escape could go wrong, but 3,000 American airmen were successful in evading the Nazis and getting back home. So what was it like in the hands of the resistance? Well, First Lieutenant Milton Shevchik had flown 16 missions with the 8th Air Force and was on his 17th mission when things went horribly wrong for the 25-year-old pilot. His formation was under attack by 20 Me-109 fighters coming in high at 2 o'clock. His plane was hit but still flyable until a group of Focke-Wulf 190s attacked him head-on. The coup de grace was given by one last fighter. A Focke-Wulf 190 came in at about 90 degrees and shot up his tail section and control cables. So, with his number 2 engine hit and a fire in the cockpit, he found himself in the unenviable position of ordering his crew to bail out over enemy territory. Now, Shevchik was the last man out. At 5,000 feet, he went headfirst out of the emergency hatch. Once out of the plane, he pulled his ripcord. Now, when he hit the ground, he was dragged across a plowed field until he was able to use the quick release button on his harness. Shevchik had landed in occupied France in an area of Beauvais in the Odyssey department in northern France. Now, a group of Frenchmen came running down the hill, waving wildly and calling, "Camarade, camarade," over and over again to Shevchik. A 16-year-old boy and an older man quickly retrieved Shevchik's parachute and flying boots, which he had taken off once he landed, and hid them properly. The rest of the group, speaking in rapid French, pointed to a nearby barn on the other side of the field. The group quickly ran towards the safety of the barn. Shevchik was now in the hands of the French people. He was not yet in the pipeline of the organized resistance, but his odds of success had increased dramatically. Shevchik was joined by his engineer, Staff Sergeant Stump, who had landed nearby. When they had reached the barn, Shevchik took out his language card. This was a card all airmen carried. They basically had common phrases written down to use to communicate to the friendly natives. Now, they would have common phrases such as, "I am an American airman," "Food, where are the Germans?" and so on. Shevchik and Stump were told to hide in the haystack and wait. Now, at noon, people came back and brought food and wine. Both men were given a liter of wine each. As Shevchik and Stump were eating, their co-pilot, Lieutenant Thorson, showed up, accompanied by the Frenchman who had helped him evade initial capture. Now, while they were waiting for the Frenchman to come back, Shevchik, Stump, and Thorson discussed plans to walk around Paris. Yep, they were going to walk around Paris, see the sights. Okay, probably not the brightest thing to do, but these were young and foolish men. I mean, there is something to the fact that the best place to hide in plain sight is a large city. But seriously? So while they were making the plans to walk around Paris, 2 large German cars pulled up outside of the barn and asked the civilians if they had seen any parachutists. All the civilians just shook their head and said no. Surprisingly, the Germans believed the civilians and left. Shevchik stated in his E&E report, that's escape and evasion, during the afternoon, many people passed by the barn, stared up at the barn. Everybody in the region seemed to know we were there. At 1600, now that's 4 p.m., the boy returned with clothes for the 3 men. A Frenchman about 30 years old led Shevchik, Stump, and Thorson to the town of Beauvais, about a mile away. It was here that Shevchik was taken to see his radio operator, Staff Sergeant Sitter, and his tail gunner, Sergeant Higgins, located in another house in the village. Shevchik was informed that 3 men from the 2 planes shot down that day had died. 2 other men from Lieutenant Hoffman's crew were captured as they were burning the papers of one of the dead men. Now, the men stayed with the old woman who fed them scrambled eggs, meat, and more wine. It was here that the men were able to wash up, shave, change their clothes, and give their names and addresses to the organization, as the resistance was called then. Now, at the next house, a man by the name of Gilbert Thibault asked various questions and said he would have their identities checked through Paris. Shevchik, Stump, and Thorson were in the pipeline of the resistance escape route. They had made it. Once the questions had been asked and answered, the men were moved across the street to stay the night there. Now, the next morning, the helpers woke the men up, cooked breakfast for them, and one Frenchman stayed with the men all day, making sure they did not leave or accidentally give themselves away. Now, once they reached Crèvecoeur, the men stayed in different homes. Sergeant Stump stayed with the local school teacher. Lieutenant Thorson stayed with Monsieur Desambord. Shevchik went to the home of George Bourgeois and his wife Marcel and their son Maurice. It was here that Shevchik found out that George, his wife, and son were in the organization. They didn't call it the resistance at that time. Now, he also found out that there were at least 40 active members in the organization, as well as another 80 who would resist when the invasion started. Now, the men stayed in Crèvecoeur from February 9th to February 18th. George Bourgeois told the men that the English had airdropped a radio transmitter to the organization in Crèvecoeur, but since the directions were in English, they could not get it to work. Yeah, an important point to take note of here: if you ever find yourself in charge of sending clandestine radio sets to a resistance organization, make sure the directions are in the proper language. I mean, I'm just saying. It's the little things that turn success into failure. Now, while waiting in Crèvecoeur, Lieutenant Hoffman arrived with 4 members of his crew and joined the group. Shevchik was able to move about the town even though there were several hundred Germans stationed in the town, as well as other units of artillery stationed nearby. Now, the local leaders of the organization, Monsieur A.S.A.A, interviewed Shevchik. He wanted the crew list, the squadron and group numbers, as well as one of the dog tags. At first, Shevchik hesitated, but realized he had no choice. He either gave the information or he would probably be shot. Now, Monsieur A.S.A.A also collected the group's maps, compasses, and 1 photo from each man. Now, this would be used to produce identity cards, which would be provided to the men when they reached Beauvais. It was standard for each airman to have an escape kit in the event of being shot down. Now, the kit consisted of Horlick tablets, that's malted milk tablets, tubed milk, never heard of that, chocolate or peanut bars, Benzodrine tablets, that was for tea, Halazin tablets, that was to purify water, matches, a water bottle, a sewing kit, adhesive tape, chewing gum, compass, a purse with money, francs, guilders, pesos, ID photos, 3 front and 3 side views. Now, on the 18th of February, Gilbert Thibault came back with work clothes and told Hoffman, Thorson, Sergeant Wall, and Shevchik to act deaf and dumb if they were stopped on the road as they made their way to Just-Les-Marais. Now, here they stayed at 158 Rue Astrid Briand's, the house of a coal dealer named Vivacon. The next door neighbors were Monsieur and Madame Rousseau, also in the organization. Monsieur Rousseau ran the bus line between Crèvecoeur and Beauvais. Now, on February 23rd, Shevchik and his men were moved to 24 Rue de Clermont in Beauvais. It was the house of Lucien Rivard. Now, he worked at the airfield outside of the city near Tilly. Madame Rivard worked in the local post office where she was able to intercept messages before going through the censor. Now, Madame Rivard stated that a family living about 8 kilometers outside of town had been caught by the Gestapo hiding U.S. flyers. The whole family was shot. Now, with her position in the post office, it allowed her to intercept letters that exposed people in the organization in that area before they were delivered to the local Gestapo headquarters. One of the problems the people in the organization had was feeding the evadés. Now, Monsieur Rivard complained that he was having a hard time feeding the evading airmen because he was only paid 45 cents a day at his job. That's in 1943 money. Now, it was in Beauvais that Shevchik and his men had the longest stay. In his report, Shevchik stated, "Thorson and I began to wonder if we were in the hands of a competent organization after we had stayed several weeks. No one had stayed there so long." Now, Rivard explained that something had gone wrong. The Paris organization was having some trouble. Now, to make it easier for his charges, Monsieur Rivard obtained identity cards for the district, or as they called it in France, the department. The men could at least go outside within the district. Rivard was even able to take the men to a football game on a Sunday. Regular, just like an everyday regular life, I guess. Shevchik and Thorson were introduced to a man by the name of Jacques, who claimed to be British and working for military intelligence. He said he was working on getting them out soon to England. Now, the men were getting frustrated with the delays. Now, with the help of Rivard, Shevchik and Thorson began planning to walk to Switzerland. Yeah, walk to Switzerland. So when Jacques heard about the plan, he went ballistic. He gave the men hell. At this point, Jacques explained they were working on a plan to get the men out by boat from Brittany. Finally, on March 16th, Shevchik and Thorson were moved. Now, Gilbert Thibault and another man showed up at Rivard's home with the truck. Now, if the truck was stopped, the men were instructed to say they had been picked up along the side of the road and they did not know Thibault or the other man. Now, the next stop was Clermont. They stayed with the mayor, Monsieur Fleury, at 25 Rue de Mony. The house was big enough to have an enclosed garden where the men could sit outside in the sun, and it was here that Shevchik and Thorson met up with Staff Sergeant Helsel and Bernier. Jacques joined the 4 evading airmen at the mayor's house to inform them that since the town of Cray had been bombed, they could not be moved right away. By February 18th, Jacques and the men left Paris. As they passed through Cray, the men took note of the damage which was done by the Allied bombing. Now, you got to remember, even though they were shot down as airmen, they still had to observe what they saw as far as bomb damage was troops in the area, the flashings on the collars and stuff, because they were still considered active members of the U.S. Army Air Corps, and that was their job. Now, once in Paris, the men were met at the station by a young woman named Margot and a sailor. They were told that Margot and the sailor were waiting for 12 more Americans who were coming from Beauvais. I mean, this was going to be a regular tourist party. Now, Jacques took the group to a hotel near the Anatole station on the metro, where the men met up with Lieutenant Lax and Sergeant Wall. Jacques received word that the boat coming to get all the Americans had been shot at, and the Nazi patrols were too active to risk starting the next leg of the journey. Now, on the 20th, Jacques informed Shevchik that he would be leaving. The sailor took Shevchik to the Gare Montparnasse station, where Shevchik joined other members of the party. Now, the conductor on the train was also part of this organization, and he had reserved a compartment for the men. At this point, there were 7 Americans and 1 guide. After an all-night ride, the party had to change trains at Saint-Brieuc. It was while waiting on the platform that the men started to feel uneasy. Both the French and the Germans seemed to be eyeing the airmen. Shevchik heard one Frenchman say to another, "Don't look at them, they're Americans." Now, the escape group boarded a train to Gangoum without incident. Now, at Gangoum, the group was housed in a flour mill for the night. By that afternoon, Shevchik and Wall were joined by 11 other evadés. They were taken by truck to a farmhouse near Pampelune. Now, this farmhouse would be their final stop. The group stayed at the farmhouse for 2 days. Now, on the 23rd, a 24-year-old girl who lived in the house took the men out after dark and led them to the beach at Puat. They were also accompanied by a gendarme, that's French police officer. The last stop on the escape route was a small farm where the men were given a security talk and asked to turn over all their money. It was a short half an hour or so walk to the beach. The men slid down a cliff, then waited in the rocks for 2 hours until they were picked up by boat and brought back to England. Now, the total number of days Shevchik was on the run was 40 days. You know, I'm kind of surprised the U.S. government didn't try to charge these flyers who escaped for a free trip through France. You know, somewhere in the bureaucratic machine there was some officious bureaucrat who thought that the government should require repayment. I'm just saying. Well, anyways, when he got back to England, he was debriefed by the military intelligence. They wrote up his E&E, or Escape and Evasion report. At the time, if an air crewman was shot down, they were no longer able to fly missions over Europe. It was too dangerous. If they were shot down a second time and captured, they might talk under torture about any of the escape routes they used or any people that helped them. So these reports are now available online at the National Archives. They're a fascinating glimpse into what these young men went through. Now, as a matter of fact, the E&E report of Major Keith Willis is a fascinating read. To begin with, he had crash-landed his P-38 fighter in the middle of a soccer field during a game, scattering the spectators and players everywhere. And in the confusion, he stole a bike and began his escape. At one point in his report, Willis described watching a bombing raid over a large Belgian town that he was living in. A B-17 had caught fire and several parachutes could be seen in the air. Now, from his vantage point in a home, Willis watched one of the parachuters come down in the middle of a walled garden. Willis stated, "Just as he touched the ground, a German motorcyclist stopped in front of the house and ran around to clamber over the garden wall at the back. Now, when the German got into the garden, the American burst through the front door of the house, hopped on the German's motorcycle, which was so conveniently left for him. He tore off down the street, blowing his horn as loud as he could while being cheered on by the Belgian people. Now, unfortunately, though," he states, "I saw the start of his evasion. I never learned how he made it out, nor did I find out who he was." I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. The files are full of interesting stories like this. Well, anyways, I hope you liked this story. You found it interesting. Now, if you did, hey, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and please leave a comment down below. That helps the algorithm and more people will find out about my channel. Thank you for watching.